It had been raining when they brought her the news. The sky hung low and gray, pressing against the wooden walls of her great hall. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting long shadows against the stone. The scent of damp earth clung to the air. Princess Olga of Kiev sat at the head of the long wooden table, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the arms of her chair. She was not a woman who slouched. She had ruled beside her husband, Igor, for years, managing affairs while he waged war and collected tribute. Kievan Rus had been built on strength, on blood, on the unyielding will of rulers who bent to no one. And now, Igor was gone. He had ridden to collect tribute from the Drevlians, as he had many times before, but this time they had refused. They had waited for him to turn his back, then dragged him from his horse. They had tied each of his legs to 2 young trees, bending them toward the earth. Then, they let the trees go. His body had been ripped apart. A violent, humiliating death. A message. A warning. She stared at the messengers kneeling before her. They had come from Iskorostan, the Drevlian capital, a people who had long resented Igor's rule. And now, their prince Mal dared to send these men to stand before her with his offer. A warrior standing beside Olga's chair, an old, battle-hardened man named Sveneld, stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of his sword. "You dare come here," he growled, his deep voice thick with hatred. The messengers did not flinch. They were armed with more than steel. They were armed with arrogance. The burly one in the front, the leader of the group, spoke with an air of casual authority, as if he had already won. "Prince Mal sends his greetings," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Your husband is dead. A foolish man, really. He came to collect tribute, again, and he was given what he deserved." Sveneld stepped forward, but Olga raised a hand. He froze. The room was silent. Her dark eyes did not move from the messenger. The burly man smirked. "Prince Mal is willing to show you mercy," he continued. "Our people are strong. It is only natural that we rule Kievan Rus now. That is why our prince has chosen to take you as his wife." The second messenger, a thinner, wiry man, added, "You will ride with us to Iskorostan. You will be treated well, princess. Your son will be cared for." Her son. She thought of Sviatoslav, her boy, just a child, too young to understand the treachery in this room, too young to know that his father had been ripped apart between 2 trees. She let out a slow breath. Prince Mal thought he had won. The Drevlians thought they had put her in her place. They thought she would bow. And so, she smiled. A small, quiet thing, a widow's smile. She looked down, as if in demure acceptance. Then she nodded. "I accept." The messengers glanced at one another, surprised. The wiry one raised an eyebrow. "You do?" Olga lifted her gaze. "Of course. But it would be improper for me to travel to Iskorostan without proper honor. Your prince is a mighty man, is he not?" The burly one puffed his chest. "He is." "Then let him send his noblest warriors to escort me. If I am to be the wife of a great prince, I should arrive with the dignity of a queen." The messengers grinned. This had been easier than expected. They bowed and promised to return with the finest men of Iskorostan to escort her to her new life as Prince Mal's wife. Olga watched them ride away, her hands tightened into fists. She had no intention of marrying Prince Mal. She had no intention of being led to Iskorostan in chains. She had no intention of letting them leave her lands alive. The Drevlians thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. The Drevlians returned in force. 50 of their finest warriors rode into Kiev, their armor gleaming in the pale light, their horses kicking up mud as they approached Olga's court. They had come to collect their new queen. They would never leave. Olga met them at the gates, dressed in her mourning robes. She was the picture of obedience. Humble, grieving, broken. "Your proposal is pleasing to me," Olga told her interlocutors. "Indeed, my husband cannot rise again from the dead, but I desire to honor you tomorrow in the presence of my people. Return now to your boat and remain there. I shall send for you on the morrow." The warriors exchanged pleased glances. Their prince had been right. Olga was no fool. She knew her place. That evening, the Drevlians rested in their long, narrow riverboats, docked along the banks of the Dnieper. Olga had arranged for them to remain aboard while feasting, a sign of respect, she said, for their strength as warriors. Her servants carried platters of roasted meats and golden mead down to them, placing them carefully in their laps. The Drevlians ate greedily, drank deeply, their laughter echoing across the water. Olga stood on the shore, watching, smiling, waiting. When the night was at its peak, when their cups had been drained and their tongues had grown thick with drink, she spoke. "You are my honored guests," she said, "and it would not be fitting for men of your stature to walk to my court. No, you shall be carried in your boats, as befits men of your rank." The warriors laughed, pleased with her submission. They did not know the grave had already been dug. The next morning, hundreds of Olga's men arrived at the riverbank. They hoisted the long wooden boats onto their shoulders, the warriors still inside. The Drevlians, still drowsy from drink, sat proudly within their vessels, amused by the grand display. Through the winding streets of Kiev, they were carried, lifted high like kings. The people gathered along the path, murmuring, watching in silence. The warriors did not notice that the road they followed was leading them outside the walls. They did not see the massive trench, 40 feet long, 12 feet deep, waiting at the city's edge. The moment they reached the pit, Olga gave the command. The boats tilted forward. The warriors tumbled down. The first hit the ground with a crack. Panic set in. Hands clawed at the edges. Voices screamed. Then the shovels began to move. Olga stood at the edge of the trench, looking down at the trapped warriors. "Do you find this honor to your taste?" she asked. Dirt rained down. The warriors thrashed, trying to push their way free, but the weight of their own boats pinned them down. Their armor became an iron coffin. The shovels moved faster, more. Soon, there was nothing left to hear. The first blood had been spilled, but Olga was just getting started. Prince Mal was still waiting. Days had passed since he had sent his messengers to Kiev. Surely by now, Olga had received his proposal. Surely by now, she had accepted. But the messengers had not returned. No word, no response. And then, finally, a message. The letter arrived in Iskorostan, bearing Olga's royal seal. It was exactly what Mal had wanted to hear. The princess was willing. She would accept his hand. But she had one request. "If I am to come to Iskorostan as your wife, I must be treated with honor," the letter read. "Send your highest-ranking noblemen, the wisest and most powerful men of your court, to escort me. If I am to be your queen, I must arrive in a manner befitting of one." Prince Mal smiled. The woman knew her place. Without hesitation, he summoned his lords, the wealthiest, most powerful men of the Drevlian tribe, the same men who had plotted Igor's murder. "This is a great day," Mal told them. "Go to Kiev and bring Olga back to me." And so they rode, cloaked in fine furs, armed not with swords, but with arrogance. When they arrived in Kiev, Olga greeted them with open arms. Her face was warm, her voice was soft. "You must be exhausted from your journey," she said gently. "You are honored guests in my home. Before we speak of marriage, let me offer you rest, a bath, to cleanse the road from your skin." The noblemen laughed, exchanging knowing glances. "A wise woman," one of them murmured. "A good wife." They followed Olga's servants through the courtyard, past the great hall, and toward the bathhouse. It was a magnificent structure, built of sturdy wood and stone, filled with the scent of birch and steam. Inside, great basins of hot water had been prepared, waiting for them. The Drevlians stripped off their traveling clothes, eager to sink into the heat. Then, the doors slammed shut. The latch dropped into place, a heartbeat of silence. Then, the first flame. It crept along the wooden beams, small at first, then growing, stretching, feeding. The fire spread. The Drevlians smelled the smoke before they saw it. Then, panic. They rushed to the doors, pounded on them, screamed. "Princess," one of them shouted, "open the door." Outside, Olga stood still. "Does the heat not suit you, my lords?" she murmured. A choked wail from within. The flames climbed higher. The walls cracked. The ceiling groaned. Inside the bathhouse, the noblemen collapsed, their final screams swallowed by the fire. And Olga watched. The bathhouse burned to the ground. The highest lords of the Drevlians were gone. Yet, she was not done. She turned to her waiting servants. "Send word to Iskarostan," she said. "Tell Prince Mal that I accept his proposal. I will come to him myself." The messenger disappeared into the cold. Olga stood in the fading light, her face unreadable. She had buried the first. She had burned the second. Now it was time for the third. Prince Mal had waited long enough. He had sent his messengers. He had sent his finest noblemen. And still, he had received no word until now. The message arrived from Kiev, sealed with Olga's mark. She was coming. But first, she wished to mourn her husband properly. "Prepare a grand funeral feast at Igor's burial site," her message read. "Gather the Drevlians to honor his memory, and I will arrive as your bride." Mal could hardly contain his delight. This was it. Olga was his. The preparations were set in motion immediately. Food, wine, mead, barrels upon barrels of it. The Drevlians gathered in droves, dressed in their finest, eager to witness the union of their prince and the princess of Kiev. And then, she arrived. Olga rode into Iskarostan with a small retinue of guards, clad in mourning attire. Her face was solemn, her posture composed. She walked toward the great banquet hall, where the feast had already begun. The Drevlians welcomed her with open arms, raising their cups in tribute. Prince Mal stood at the head of the gathering, eyes gleaming. "Come, my lady," he said. "Let us honor your husband before we celebrate our union." Olga took her seat. She raised her cup. "To my husband," she murmured. The Drevlians roared their agreement, downing their drinks. The mead flowed freely. The night stretched on. And the Drevlians, oh, the Drevlians, drank. They drank until their voices slurred. They drank until their hands fumbled at their belts. They drank until their heads lolled and their eyes glazed over. And then Olga stood. "Now," she said. The hall erupted. Her guards moved swiftly, steel flashing in the torchlight. Blades plunged into unsuspecting throats. Drunken men toppled where they sat, unable to react before death found them. Chaos spread like fire, but there was no escape. The doors had been barred. The feast turned into a slaughter. 5,000 men lay dead by dawn. Olga wiped the blood from her hands and turned to her remaining warriors. "Return to Kiev," she commanded. "Gather my army. This is not over." By the time the sun rose over Iskarostan, there was no celebration, only silence. Years passed. The Drevlians still lived behind their walls, but they were broken, scattered, a shadow of the people they had once been. But Olga had not forgotten them. Not yet. She had burned their strongest warriors. She had buried their emissaries alive. She had slaughtered their men in a drunken feast. But she had not yet taken their home. And so, in the final stage of her vengeance, she rode to Iskarostan one last time. The city stood tall against the horizon, blackened with soot, but still unbroken. Olga's forces had encircled them for over a year, choking off their supplies, starving them into submission. The Drevlians had no allies left. Their cities had fallen. Their warriors had been slaughtered. But still, they held on. They had no choice. Behind those walls was Prince Mal, the man who had sent those arrogant messengers to her halls, the man who had dared to believe she would bow to him, the man who had taken her husband from her. But Olga did not waste time throwing soldiers at stone walls. No, she had another way in mind. When the Drevlians finally sent word begging for mercy, she answered. Her reply was simple. Why do you persist in holding out? All your cities have surrendered to me. But if you fear that I still seek vengeance, let me prove otherwise. The Drevlians hesitated, but desperation left them with no choice. They asked what tribute she desired. Olga's request was small, so small that it seemed laughable. Give me 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house, that is all. The Drevlians rejoiced. It was nothing, a mere handful of birds. A city spared for such a meager price. They agreed instantly. The birds were gathered and delivered to Olga's camp outside the walls. But as the Drevlians celebrated, her soldiers were hard at work. Olga took each bird, tying a small bundle of sulfur and cloth to their feet. The sulfur had been finely ground, mixed with bits of charcoal, wrapped tightly in oil-soaked rags, materials that would burn slow, but with an inescapable, smoldering heat. The soldiers moved with methodical precision, securing the deadly payload to the struggling creatures. The air filled with the sharp, acrid scent of burning resin as torches were brought forward. At Olga's signal, the rags were touched with flame. Tiny tongues of fire flickered to life, dancing along the cloth, creeping toward the sulfur. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she gave the order. The birds were released. A cloud of wings rose into the night sky, carrying fire in their talons. Some hesitated, confused by the weight, by the heat licking at their feet. But instinct was stronger than pain. They flew home, back to their nests, under eaves, in thatched roofs, inside wooden storehouses. The first flames took hold, then another, and another. Within minutes, the city was ablaze. The fire spread too quickly to contain, leaping from building to building as the wind carried embers across rooftops. People rushed to douse the flames, but it was too late. The sulfur-fed inferno burned hotter than they could fight. Smoke poured into the streets, thick and choking, blinding those who tried to flee. Screams rose in the night, shouts of panic, of pain, of hopelessness. The city gates burst open as terrified Drevlians poured out, fleeing the inferno, only to be met with swords. Olga's army was waiting. No mercy, no escape. Some were slaughtered where they stood, cut down before they could even draw breath. Some were captured and dragged away in chains, destined for the slave markets of Kiev. They were left alive, to pay tribute to Olga. The great city of Iskarostan was no more. And Prince Mal. Sources differ on his fate. Some say he was dragged before Olga in chains, forced to kneel at her feet as she stared down at him with cold, unwavering eyes. That she did not grant him the swift death he might have hoped for. That instead, she had him executed slowly, humiliatingly, perhaps flayed alive, perhaps burned as his city had burned. Others say she took her vengeance another way, that she forced him to become her servant, a broken man reduced to nothing but a living warning to those who might dare defy her. What is certain is this. The Drevlians had killed her husband, and she had destroyed them for it. With her vengeance complete, Olga returned to Kiev, her throne secured, her son's future protected. The Drevlians were no longer a threat. They were barely even a people. The fires of Iskarostan had long since died. The blood had dried. The screams had faded into memory. Olga of Kiev had won, and yet her work was far from over. The throne of Kievan Rus was hers, held in trust for her young son, Sviatoslav. She had ensured that no rival could challenge him. No tribe would dare to defy her rule. But war and vengeance could not build a lasting kingdom. If Kievan Rus was to survive, it needed something stronger than fear. It needed unity, and Olga was about to reshape her world in a way that no one could have foreseen. She turned her eyes south, to Constantinople, the seat of the Byzantine Empire, the jewel of the Christian world, of wealth, of something more lasting than brute strength. Olga had spent her life steeped in pagan traditions. She had offered sacrifices to the gods of her ancestors. She had ruled by sword and blood, as her forebears had. But the world was changing, and Olga had no intention of being left behind. In the year 957, she traveled to Constantinople to meet the most powerful man in the world, Emperor Constantine VII. The court of the Byzantines was unlike anything Olga had ever seen. The golden halls, the towering domes, the whispered politics of nobles who waged wars with words instead of steel. She was a barbarian queen in their eyes, a woman who had crushed her enemies beneath her heel, and yet they could not ignore her, because she was powerful, because she was clever, because she was exactly the kind of ally Constantine needed. The emperor was fascinated by her. He entertained her, flattered her, and in time, he made her an offer. Baptism. The Christian faith was spreading across the world, and the Byzantines sought to bring more rulers into their fold. If Olga converted, it would not only bring prestige, it would bring protection. And Olga saw an opportunity. She agreed. The great patriarch of Constantinople himself oversaw the ceremony. Olga was baptized, taking the Christian name Helena after the emperor's wife. But Constantine had something else in mind: marriage. A union between Kievan Rus and Byzantium, a bond that would cement Olga's place among the rulers of the world. But Olga had played this game before. She had evaded Prince Mal's grasp. She had tricked and slaughtered those who sought to control her. And she would not be bound to Constantine. When he raised the subject, she smiled and bowed her head. "But my lord," she said softly, "you are my godfather in baptism." Constantine hesitated. She had chosen him to stand as her baptismal sponsor, and in the laws of the church, that made them spiritual family, and spiritual family could not marry. She had outmaneuvered the most powerful emperor in the world with a single, well-placed move. Constantine could do nothing but accept it. Olga returned to Kiev as a Christian queen. But Kievan Rus was not ready for the faith she had embraced. The people clung to their gods. They worshipped in the old ways, in the forests and rivers, in the ancient rites of their ancestors. Even her son, Sviatoslav, scoffed at her new faith. "If I were to be baptized," he told her, "my warriors would laugh at me." And so Olga ruled alone. She did not force her people to convert, but she built churches. She laid the foundation. She knew that the future of Kievan Rus did not lie in the old gods. It lay in something stronger, something that could bind people together, as fear never could. It would take time. It would take generations. But Olga had set the wheels in motion, and one day, her grandson, Vladimir, would finish what she had begun. Kievan Rus would become Christian, and the woman who had burned her enemies alive would be remembered not as a warrior, but as a saint.